Well, good morning. This is the Lew Rockwell Show, and so great to have as our guest again, Judge John V. Denson. Judge Denson is, was an important judge. He's an important attorney and continues to be an important historian as well. And we'll be linking to his books at the end of this podcast. But he's going to be talking today about two additional books that he's read, one on the Kennedy assassination, one on the murder of James B. Forrestal. So, John, tell us about these books and tell us what they signify. This is fascinating material.
Well, these are two books that I had time to read during the close down of due to the virus. So I was reading the third book I've read of William Engdahl, who's a geopolitical writer, and in sort of an off-the-cuff statement, he mentions that about the confession of one of the assassins of John Kennedy. And I went back and read the sentence again. I said, well, what? I don't know about a confession being made that's been written about. So fortunately, there was a footnote, and it cited a book called Files, F-I-L-E-S, on JFK, interview with the confessed assassin James E. Files. It's was published in 2005, but it's the first time I've ever heard of the book, the first time I've ever heard that anybody confessed to the murder. And I was very skeptical about it, but I ordered it, and it came right away from Amazon. And the man that's behind doing the book and is financed at the time this book was published of about $1 million for the investigation is a guy from the Netherlands named Wim, W-I-M, Dankebaugh. And when I got it, it looked so ominous with 600 pages. I said, well, I'm not going to start and read it. It's not a narrative. It's got chapters you can read, and one chapter is the first deposition given by Files on the murder, and that was in 1994. And then he did another one in 2004, I think it is. And so I read those transcripts, and they were so detailed and so convincing that then I went back and read the whole book, and it's got interviews with other important witnesses to the JFK murder. So this is the sort of the backstory of how this came about. There was a private investigator who was retired named Joe West, and he filed a lawsuit to exhume the body of Kennedy in order to see what changes were made by the autopsy. And there was a rumor that the body is not really there, that it was removed later. So he wanted to get the body exhumed and see what could be found. So he was given a tip by a retired FBI agent and just said, look, you might want to talk to this guy named Files, who's in prison in Illinois for attempted murder. And the agent said, I interviewed him back years ago. He was part of the Chicago mob. And he might be able to tell you something, but he didn't say anything about assassination. So Miles had been contacted by various people like Oliver Stone. They'd seen him 3 times trying to get him to talk, and he refused to talk. And he said later he just didn't like Oliver Stone's personality and didn't trust him, but he did get his autograph. But he liked Joe West, and he was interested in the lawsuit. And he told Joe West that if you look in the brain, if it's Kennedy, there'll be mercury there. But he didn't tell him why that would be there, but that'll be a sign that it is the real body. So Joe West had heart problems, and then something happened to the medication, and Files thinks he was murdered. And so the lawsuit got dropped. But a guy named Bob Vernon then steps in and starts talking to Files. And he's the one that was able to get the video deposition the first time. And then there was a second video deposition the second time. There are 2 of them. So Files finally tells the whole story of how the assassination took place. So his background was he grew up on the streets of Chicago, a tough neighborhood, and committed his first murder when he was just 16 years old. It was a revenge murder, a family feud. And then he joined the Army in the 82nd Airborne and Special Forces, and was stationed in Laos in 1959 and 1960, and was became known as an expert marksman and a vicious murderer. And I don't know what his military record, whether he got discharged or what happened, but the word got out to the Chicago mob when he came back that this might be a good guy to get on our team. So they hired him. A guy named Charles Nicoletti was the main hit man for the Chicago mob. And he hired him as a driver first. And then he got him to run what's called a chop shop, where they take cars and chop them up and so forth. And that's where this FBI agent that gave the tip to Joe West first met Files. And so then Nicoletti tells him, I want you to work with me on some assignments. So they worked together with the CIA on some murders. And he says that he and Nicoletti one time went to the CIA plane to South America and killed about 50 people. So anyway, they get up to the close to the time of the Kennedy murder, and the first time he heard about it was the murder was going to take place in Chicago because Kennedy was going to visit Chicago. Then that was called off. Then it was going to be in Dallas. And his assignment, he said, was that he was just going to be a secondary shooter, that he was supposed to go to Dallas and take all the weapons in a hidden compartment in a car and take them to a motel. Then the next day somebody would contact him and take him to a place where he could test those weapons and calibrate the sight. I guess one of the most amazing things about this is that the gun that he used was furnished to him by a prominent CIA guy named Atlee Phillips. And Phillips later became one of the top CIA people. But that was his contact person that he was supposed to stay in contact with. And Phillips was the only other person that knew he was at this motel. So there was a knock on the door, and it was Oswald. He'd never met Oswald before. And he said, how did you know I was here? He said, my contact is Atlee Phillips. And so they had the same control guy with the CIA. So the gun that he was furnished to use was called a Fireball. And it was a specially made gun that was not on the market for the public at the time, but the CIA had it. And it looked like a pistol, but it had a sight on it and a collapsible stock that you could put on your shoulder. And it shot one bullet. And he said that there was a man called Wolfman in the Chicago mob that altered the bullet. So he bored a hole in the front and put mercury in it and then put a cap on it. So it was a high velocity weapon. And when it hit the target, it exploded. So he said that's what happened with the Kennedy assassination. So he was to be an alternate shooter, and the main shooter was going to be Nicoletti. And Oswald wasn't involved at all in the shooting. And that Nicoletti was in the back, and the shot was going to be to the back of Kennedy's head. But if Nicoletti did not get a good headshot, then Files was to be the secondary shooter, and he was have to shoot Kennedy from the front. And they didn't want to do that; didn't have to. But Nicoletti's first shot hit Kennedy in the back, so that meant Files had to shoot. So he aimed at the right eye, and Nicoletti fired a second shot almost simultaneously, which hit Kennedy in the head and knocked it a little bit forward. Then Files' shot knocked it backwards and knocked the back of his head off. So in one of the depositions, he's confronted with the statement, well, how many shots did you fire? He said, I fired one. So were you the only person firing from the front? He said, as far as I know. He said, well, how do you explain the bullet hole in the front of Kennedy's throat? He said, well, in a team approach like we have here, they never tell you who else is involved. So if there's another shooter and you're arrested and you're given some sort of truth serum, you don't know who the other people are. He said, if there was another shooter, I was not told about it. So it's possible that could be. So the murder takes place, and then the 3 times that people try to murder him. And Nicoletti was murdered just before he was to testify before a congressional committee, and the man above Nicoletti was also murdered. But I guess Files is safer in prison than he would be anywhere. So the book goes into a whole lot of things to bolster the story. And it's amazing to me that this detailed report in this 600-page book with all these details has never received as much publicity. I'm not an expert on the Kennedy assassination. I've read James Douglas' book, which I think is really good, The Unspeakable, Why Kennedy Was Killed and Why It Matters. And, of course, I read the first one that came out by Mark Lane, But maybe there are people that are very familiar with this book, but it is extremely interesting. And the first time I've ever read the gory details of how the murder took place. So it's a book that I recommend people look at, especially the experts on the Kennedy assassination, and make up your own mind about the credibility of Files. But the details that he has and all the information the FBI has apparently furnished secretly to these investigators, I suppose these are retired FBI agents that interviewed other people, that these other people they interviewed gave testimony that was inconsistent with the lone assassin of Oswald. So the FBI told them to be quiet and disappear. They didn't turn their names over to the Warren Commission, but they turned them over to this investigation here. So those people are interviewed that show that there were multiple shooters from multiple directions. It even implicates the Bush family some, that George H.W. Bush was involved with a lot of the people in Dallas that helped arrange all this. But Files is asked, well, do you have any regrets about killing Kennedy? He said, no, I didn't like him. I said, why not? He said, well, he betrayed the people at the Bay of Pigs invasion, and I never liked him after that. So he had no remorse about killing the President of the United States. But the thing that stands out to me is how the involvement of the CIA so intimately with the mob in Chicago, how they use them for regime changes in foreign countries, but how they have the president murdered in America with the weapon that they furnished the assassin. So it's a remarkable story.
I remember the evil Pompeo, who's now Secretary of State but was head of the CIA. He gave a talk to a graduating class of some college, I don't remember which one, and he said in his talk, he said, of course, as head of the CIA, we lied and we stole, and a lot of people pointed out, well, he's of course not mentioning he murdered, because the CIA is mostly a murder operation, as this book shows in one small aspect of it. No telling how many people they kill, and I was told by one expert on this that they specialize in killing people within the United States as well as overseas, mainly on the operating table if somebody has to go.
Well, that's what Files thinks happened to Joe West. He thinks that somebody messed with his medication and killed him while he was in the hospital. I might go back to give you the full name of Phillips is CIA David Atlee Phillips.
Yes, yeah, famous guy,
was the contact man for Files and Oswald.
Wow.
Files says one other thing is that Oswald was supposed to have been shot by one of the Chicago mob people right afterwards. And the policeman got in the way, and he had to shoot the policeman first. And so then they had to call on Ruby to finish off Oswald before he talked. But Oswald, as he indicates, was a patsy.
Yes, and as he himself said he called himself a patsy.
And there must have been an interview with Oswald after the arrest and before he was shot, and we've never heard what Oswald said when he volunteered, when he yelled out, "I'm just a patsy."
Yeah.
But very interesting story. The other book that I read during the lockdown was a brand new book called Assassination of James Forrestal. James Forrestal was a man who made a fortune on Wall Street, very upstanding, intelligent person that was in the Roosevelt administration as a lower position than Secretary of Defense, but he was the first Secretary of Defense and served under Truman as Secretary of Defense. He made this statement to Truman, along with Secretary George Marshall, that Truman should not recognize the State of Israel. And after the UN had created the State of Israel, while they both made the statement, Marshall didn't make a threat to go public, but Forrestal did. Forrestal said that he planned to write a book about what happened in the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, and he was going to buy a newspaper, and he was going to go public with all this. So what this book brings out is that he had a good friend named Bernard Baruch, and Baruch told him, said, "Look, you're unwise to take that position on the State of Israel. It could be dangerous for you." Well, Forrestal kept a loose-leaf diary in his office as Secretary of Defense, and he became very agitated and nervous and so forth. They said he needed to be hospitalized, and so his diary was confiscated, and most of it purged, except for one, what appeared probably an insignificant thing, where he played golf with Joe Kennedy one day in December 1945, the diary says. And Kennedy tells him that when Kennedy was the ambassador to England, William Bullitt was the ambassador to France under Roosevelt. And the Treaty of Versailles had made a lot of alterations to create the country of Poland. Poland had ceased to exist as a country in the end of the 18th century. So one of the 14 points by Wilson was to recreate the state of Poland and build a corridor so that they would have a seaport. And the corridor went right through the middle of Germany and separated East Germany, and give them a city called Danzig, a German city, that would be run by the League of Nations. Well, Hitler was told by several of the representatives of England, diplomats, that they had no objection to Hitler negotiating a peaceful change of that they thought that his plan was very reasonable, and that plan was to build a road or a railway across the corridor to attach the separated part of Germany, and to give Danzig back to Germany because they had the corridor created another seaport for them. So Hitler was led to believe that this was something that could be negotiated peacefully. Excuse me. So that what happens in Kennedy's statement is that Roosevelt called Kennedy and said, look, we need to stop any negotiations between Poland and Germany over revising the Treaty of Versailles. So I'm telling William Bullitt to meet with the Polish authorities and tell them not to even meet with Hitler, do not negotiate. And I want you, Joe Kennedy, to tell the British to give the Poles a guarantee that if they don't negotiate and Germany attacks it, that you will guarantee that you will back them up. Kennedy tells Roosevelt, said, look, if you don't let them negotiate, Hitler will attack. And Bullitt told Roosevelt, no, they won't. They're just bluffing. Well, Poland refuses to negotiate. Hitler attacks on September 1, 1939, and World War II starts. This is a pretty inflammatory thing. So when Forrestal was in the hospital, he was supposed to be released in that morning. During the night, he allegedly commits suicide. And
jumping out the window.
He committed suicide twice. He first tied his bathrobe sash around his neck and tied a tight knot in the back to choke himself to death. Then he jumped out the window, they said. Well, obviously he was murdered, but the full report was it was suicide. So you can disregard that entry in his diary about this conversation with Joe Kennedy. That's something he imagined. And so just disregard. So anytime you mention about Forrestal's diary, and the book came out called Forrestal's Diaries, where this was in it, people have dismissed that because he committed suicide. Well, this book that's just come out is called The Assassination of James Forrestal. There was a prior book written by the John Birch Society that said that he was murdered.
Mm-hmm.
And but they didn't have the official Navy investigation report. This book, through the
Because it
freedom
was
of,
Bethesda Naval Hospital.
he was at Bethesda, which is a dangerous place to be if the government doesn't like you. To ask Joe McCarthy and others.
Yeah.
And they did the autopsy, I think, of Kennedy. I don't know, but
That's right.
anyway, and actually there was a statement that when they were forcing Forrestal out of the car to go to the hospital, he said, "I'll never come out alive." So I think he knew he was in danger. Anyway, this book came out just this year, 2019. It's written by David Martin, and he filed a Freedom of Information Act and got the official Navy investigation for the first time. It's been hidden 55 years or so, and it completely backs up the fact that he was murdered, and that's why it's been held so long. And he asked for the photographs of the autopsy and so forth. And first they said they were going to withhold them so that the family wouldn't be offended by looking at them. And then said, well, there's no family left. And said, well, they've been lost. But he did get the report. And it shows, in my opinion, that it was clearly that he was murdered. And they blame the Mossad and his statements about Israel as being the motive behind the murder. So it's a very interesting book, which leads me to an argument that I've seen and that I've done some research on as to what was Roosevelt's motive in having Poland not negotiate. Why not try to settle a dispute? So there's an interesting book that receives probably little publicity. It's called FDR and the Creation of the UN by two establishment historians, Hoops and Brinkley. And it's the story of how Roosevelt created the UN. And it brings into focus the fact that Roosevelt was in the Wilson administration as Assistant Secretary of Navy. He worshiped Wilson, and he thought that his idea of the League of Nations was the greatest thing. And so he went to the Paris Peace Conference and observed that Wilson was a person that just had complete adulation of the people. He was considered the man that brought the war to a close. He was going to solve the problem of war with the League of Nations. And then he saw Wilson screw it up with being so obnoxious, so he wouldn't negotiate any changes when he got back to get the treaty confirmed by the Senate. So then Roosevelt runs for vice president on the 1920 ticket. And something I learned from another book was that his mother, Roosevelt's mother, was a big fan of Colonel House. And she gave him the book Philip Drew, Administrator, to read in 1920, which was also a book that Wilson liked. And, of course, Colonel House was a big influence on Wilson. So you got Colonel House with influence in two presidents. But anyway, you get up to the race for vice president. He made, this book says 800 speeches in favor of the League of Nations. He was just obsessed by that failure, and the not approving the treaty. So then you get up to the Atlantic Charter, where he meets with Churchill in August before Pearl Harbor. And he brings up the United Nations and says to Churchill, now, when the war is over, we need to create the United Nations. And England will be a part of it, and Russia and China be parts of it. Of course, China wasn't communist then. But Churchill said, no, I believe in spheres of influence, but I'm not willing to give up sovereignty to join some world organization. Roosevelt made it clear that if you want America's help in your war, you're trying to get help, you better go along with this. And Roosevelt said, yeah, I think it's a good idea. So there was somebody in Roosevelt's administration also that listened in on the communications between Roosevelt and Churchill. Tyler Kent was his name. And he found out that Roosevelt was communicating with Churchill before Churchill was prime minister. and then after prime minister, and all kind of plans were being made about how America was going to get into the war, that Roosevelt was going to create a situation where America would get into the war. So we have a book now, Tyler Kent, this case of Tyler Kent, I think by Snow is his name. And he was caught intercepting those messages and tried secretly under the stealing state secrets in England on a secret trial, put in prison for the entire war, and released after the war. So we have now the story of Tyler Kent and what all Roosevelt was saying now, because that book was written. Then we also have the book of how Roosevelt got us into Pearl Harbor and got into the war. And The Day of Deceit by Stennett, to me, is the most complete book about that. Then what's amazing to me is that 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, in January of 1942, Roosevelt assembles the representatives of 26 nations, and they sign an agreement to create the United Nations. They name it the United Nations. They all agree that they're not going to make any separate peace agreements, and that they will join in a world organization named the United Nations. And then you get up to where he had to convince Stalin to get in, and he raised the same objection as Churchill about spheres of influence, but he also needed Roosevelt's help, and so you have all these nations signing on. So you get down to finally the day that Roosevelt died, and he's in Warm Springs, Georgia, and he is writing the speech that he's going to give at the opening session of the United Nations, where he intends to resign as president and lead the United Nations. So to me, there's sort of a trail of influence as to Roosevelt's motives all the way back to the peace conference up to the creation of the United Nations. And I know it's bizarre. It's just an argument. I don't know. I don't have any insight other than these books, but that's the reason that the assassination of James Forrestal is important, because that was the first indication that Roosevelt had interference. But now we have another book that is written by Herbert Hoover. And Hoover very wisely decided not to have his book published till 50 years after his death, which is what Forrestal should have done. The book by Herbert Hoover called Betrayal of Freedom, it has the interview that he had more extensively with Joe Kennedy, where he tells Herbert Hoover the same story, and he blames Roosevelt for starting World War II by making Poland refuse to negotiate the change in the Versailles Treaty and making England give the guarantee. So the invasion of Poland takes place on September 1, 1939, and so England and France then declare war on September 3. And then you have the phony war until finally, Hitler goes on and attacks, because England and France have declared war on Germany. So it really leads you to believe that that Roosevelt was massively interfering with international relations that helped bring on the war, and that his ultimate motive would be maybe that he would be the greatest man who ever lived, because he would create a world organization that would eliminate war, which was sort of the idealistic ideas of Wilson, his mentor and idol. So anyway, the Forrestal book, this new book, rehabilitates Forrestal, in my opinion, that conversation with Joe Kennedy took place, and now you have Herbert Hoover's book that verifies it 50 years after Hoover's death. So that's what I've been reading during the virus closed down, and pretty interesting books, I thought.
John, I've always been interested in old radio shows. And when I first really got interested, I was a teenager. And I was shocked to see that when they were talking about the war, giving war news and that kind of thing, it was the United Nations as versus Germany and Italy. And that's what they kept referring. This is long before the United Nations was established. But of course, I didn't realize it had been in effect established by this 26-nation treaty
It's amazing that the name had already been selected.
Yeah, no, I don't.
Yeah, I mean,
I didn't like the United Nations, so I was surprised.
Churchill that. Then he has 26 nations sign up for the United Nations 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor. Pretty suspicious.
And of course, he saw it as a much more powerful organization with himself at the head of it than it turned out to be.
Yeah, and valued that more than being president.
Yeah.
Be a head of the World Organization. United Nations caused a lot of problems, but didn't turn out to be quite the dream that Wilson and Roosevelt hoped.
Well, John, thanks. These are two fascinating books. The one on Forrestal, the one on the Kennedy, the assassination of these two men. Very important, terrible historical events. And thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Okay, I always enjoy it, Lew.
It's always fascinating. And, of course, we'll link to your books. We'll link to these two books. And hope people buy them. Your books, these books.
Yeah.
And
they're both available on Amazon. I just order them from Amazon.
Oh, that's what we'll
And there is a website for the guy that edited the book on files called JFKMurdersSolved.com.
Tremendous. John, thanks a million.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the LRC front page. Thank you.